I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be looking at the career of Diane Keaton, one that I've been sort of penciling in for the last sort of bit of this series because I knew it was one of my favorites and I want to leave it to the very end. She has such a wonderful career and is truly one of my favorite actresses, so I was very excited to do this episode. But quickly off the top, I just want to mention that we are now in the sort of fall film festival scenario, and I'd like to announce that Old's Oscar Countdown will be returning for its 7th season in 2 weeks from today. So next week will be the final episode of Movie Star Magic, in which I'll be covering the career of Steve Martin. And then after that, we're going to be going back into the Oscar season. I know you probably have all been wondering about TIFF and Venice and Telluride. We've had those festivals out. We've seen a lot of the big Oscar movies in many regards already, so now it's time to analyze them and to figure out what's going to have the best chance in all the different categories, which of course, if you're just a fan of this series, if you don't know, I do have an Oscar series that I do. Starting once this sort of series ends, we go back into the fall, and I've been doing that for the past 6 years. Very high, accurate Oscar series where I give my predictions and thoughts and sort of just chronicle the race. It's a lot of fun, so I hope you still stick around if you're a fan of this series. But how this show works is essentially I start off the show with sort of the first 2/3 of the video. I break down the actor's career into 3 separate chapters and sort of just discuss and chronicle their career and how they've sort of gotten better and have changed and evolved as an actor. And then within each of those chapters, I talk about a defining role, just so we can sort of talk about some other great movies and why they're so great in some of those performances. And then finally, the sort of last third of the video, I try to figure out what their defining feature is. What is that movie star magic? What is that one thing that they have that other people don't that make them such a compelling, likable, on-screen presence? So when you think of a Diane Keaton movie, it's different than a Jeff Bridges movie, which is different than a Tom Cruise movie, which is different than a Steve Martin movie. They all have their sort of own built-in brand that they've created, and that's what this series is trying to analyze. What is that specific thing that they have that make them so interesting? But starting things off with the first chapter, I'm calling this chapter the Woody chapter because of her sort of strong collaboration with Woody Allen in this period. And this chapter sort of chronicles 72 to about 87. And, you know, she has her first film role in 1970, but 1972 is the big year for her, in which she stars in, or, you know, is featured in The Godfather and Play It Again, Sam. So she really starts her early career with, you know, that 72. She gets The Godfather, which of course leads to The Godfather 2 and that sort of iconic role, and even The Godfather 3 later on. And then in the same year, stars opposite Woody Allen, in which that begins her sort of big career as a Woody Allen star. And as much as I want to talk about Godfather 1 and 2 or Reds, this chapter I did call the Woody chapter just because in this period from 72 to 87, she stars in 6 Woody Allen films. She appears in 7, which is about, you know, every other year she's in a Woody Allen movie. Particularly this sort of 70s period was very much defined with her collaboration with him and sort of building those movies together. So very much she was, if you think of her 70s, I think oftentimes of her Woody Allen stuff, and then, you know, say The Godfather. And also because it's fascinating to see, because Woody is oftentimes writing and directing and starring in a lot of those early movies, it's fascinating to see him opposite Diane Keaton. And I think early on in 72, he really finds her and situates her as this sort of Woody Allen avatar, the sort of prototype, the female version of Woody Allen, this sort of New York, neurotic, kind of bubbly and quirky, but still eccentric and anxious, ridden sort of a woman, and very much sort of that counterpart to Woody. It's similar in many ways, but also different, but also still able to keep up with some of that sort of quick-witted, smart, intelligent, clever dialogue she executes just perfectly, and you can see that right away in a movie like Play It Again, Sam, which Woody doesn't direct, but, you know, eventually their partnership still evolves from there, you know, arguably getting better with Play It Again, Sam, which leads to Sleeper, which leads to Love and Death, which leads to Annie Hall, which leads to Manhattan. You know, there's just this sort of chronicling there of the evolution of this sort of relationship, arguably getting better in quality each time. So she was definitely much an avatar and adopted that sort of persona that Woody created with her in these periods, and have utilized that from then on out. But also, I think Woody using her and her strengths and what she was great at as an actor to be that sort of very fascinating opposite in many of his movies. And definitely in this period, I think sort of what gets overlooked is just her credit of really creating that sort of female 90s romantic comedy avatar. You're going from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s where we're getting these screwball comedies, and then that sort of dies out, and then the Woody Allen stuff of the 70s is really the only sort of romantic comedies that are going on before we get 88 with When Harry Met Sally, and then 90 with Pretty Woman, and then sort of the 90s era of rom-coms. But this very much sort of predates it, and Diane Keaton being the female avatar and character in so many of these films really does create that sort of prototypical model. She creates that in many ways, so there's a lot of respect I give to her in this period. And then the defining role of this period, I had to go with Annie Hall, which, yes, is a boring answer, but I think ultimately the correct one. For a film done by Woody that is so personal and so much about living in someone's head. I mean, just the fact that he wrote it, he directed it, he stars in it. It is about him living in his own experiences. It's crazy to think that a movie that's so personal, that Diane is still the titular character and that she is still very much the anchor of the movie. Because this movie is a terrific movie in its own right. That it is Alan evolving as not only a writer, but I think ultimately sort of developing a visual style, creating this kind of model and form that he's gone back to, really sort of having some experimenting with the form in many ways that feels sort of free and loose. But what's fascinating about the movie is that Diane Keaton part, because there's so many other movies that we can see now of Woody being sort of neurotic in his own head. But Diane is a cheat code for the movie because she still brings so much of that emotional weight of the movie. That in a movie that has so much form breaking the fourth wall and subtitles and narration and flashbacks, with all this stuff, we can always cut back to Diane, and that emotional resonance is immediately there because of her naturalistic style of acting. Let's not forget, we're not too far away from the 40s and 50s of this sort of very much theatrical, staccato, very much movie acting in a certain regard, where everything feels a little bit more glossy and over the top and a little bit more heightened. When we see a movie like Annie Hall, there's lots of ums and I don't knows and sort of this awkwardness, very much sort of naturalistic style of acting. And what that does, what Diane brings to the film by doing that, is allowing the movie to be sort of out there in terms of its form breaking, in terms of its ability to sort of break storytelling rules, narration, fourth wall breaking, etc. So it's able to do that for sort of the comedic effect, but then still cut back to Diane Keaton. And because of her naturalistic style of acting, she's able to ground the movie. She's able to give the movie a lot of emotional resonance. So that works on both elements. The fact that on one hand it can be funny, and Diane's also very good at that, but then also she's able to hit home sort of that emotional resonance and that desire for love within the affair that's going on. And you can do all this craziness because as long as you cut back to the next scene and Diane's doing something that feels natural and feels realistic and feels grounded, she brings a lot of that emotional resonance to the film as a result. So it's a lot of her awkward mannerisms that become honest and true, and like Ali, Woody Allen's character, we too fall in love with Diane Keaton. But then jumping into the second chapter, I'm calling this chapter the Nancy chapter, which I would sort of chronicle from 1987 to 2003, in which she sort of only does one more film with Woody Allen, so her collaboration with Woody Allen ostensibly ends in this period. And in the sort of 80s and 90s, she does 4 films with Nancy Meyers. Now, 3 of the films were directed by Charles Shire, but which was her writing partner and husband at the time. So Nancy Meyers still wrote those movies, was incredibly involved in those movies, and of course does Something's Gotta Give, which is her directing directing Diane in her own movie, sort of the ultimate Nancy Meyers movie with Something's Gotta Give. So she has these sort of 4 movies, and I think she goes from sort of the Woody Allen female archetype to the sort of Nancy Meyers avatar. She does make that transition in, I think, 87, which is the last Woody Allen movie she does before Diane Keaton does before Manhattan Murder Mystery. That same year she works for the first time with Nancy Meyers in Baby Boom. And really, it's amazing to see Diane have success in this period, because she's had, a very sort of atypical career where she's almost more like her male movie stars of the time than she is necessarily her female movie stars, where we see this over and over again. Female movie stars, they're very popular when they are young, and then they are sort of no parts for the 40-year-olds, the 50-year-olds, and then maybe there's the mom part when you turn 60. There's sort of that jump. But there's this period where we see a lot of these great movie stars, either they have kids in their personal life, or Hollywood sort of doesn't make movies for them, so they're not as popular anymore. They do see this sort of drop off. But Diane is fascinating just because she can make these movies about women in their 40s and 50s and still be incredibly successful. I mean, think of a Baby Boom, think of a First Wives Club, think of a Something's Gotta Give. These are big blockbuster movies that she's at the heart of, and people are still interested in seeing her fall in love at an older age, or get revenge, or be in these comedy movies, and she still excels in them. So it's a fascinating sort of career in her longevity. She's been able to really sustain that, particularly in this sort of period that not all other actresses are able to do. And then you add on, a couple of more Oscar nominations during this period as well, and it's fascinating just her longevity, which is, a huge reason why I'm a big fan of her, but also I was a big fan of doing her for this episode, because I wanted to sort of track that career. It's a fascinating arc. But in the second chapter, the defining role, the Nancy chapter, I wanted to go with one of those 4 movies, and I ultimately went with Baby Boom. Now that's maybe a little bit of an unconventional choice, because it's arguably not the best movie of that bunch, but I do think it's her best performance. It's not Diane Keaton with Jack Nicholson, or Diane Keaton with Al Pacino, or Diane Keaton with Steve Martin or Jack Nicholson. It's really just her own movie. It's her on the poster, and she sells it. And the sort of premise of the film is that there's a sort of ultra career woman who gets a baby thrust into her lap when her deceased cousin gives up her child to her, and then how can she manage it? Can she have it all? That sort of, I would say, the premise is a bit conceited, a bit of a joke now in the modern day age. However, I still think it is an effective comedy of its time, and sort of first hour being the sort of comedic focused hijinks, sort of funny dialogue, situational humor that Diane is great in, being this career woman who has this baby sort of thrust into her lap and has to juggle all these things. But then the second half of the movie, which I would say is almost arguably better, which is kind of a controversial take, but I do think, is a little bit more sweeter, a little bit more romantic. I actually like it better just because it allows her to be less of a caricature and more of a real person. But now she moves to Vermont and slows down her life and has to care for the baby, and then worry about money and fixing up the house, and there's sort of the hijinks in that sense too, but it does become a lot more sweeter, a lot more romantic. And Diane's so terrific in it because she can do both. It's a great movie because it shows that she can do both in the one movie. The sweet, the romantic side, the stuff with Sam Shepard is definitely, I felt genuine. And then in the first half, she can be these sort of kind of more broad, almost physical humor, broad comedy kind of a stuff that she's excellent at doing that too. So she can sort of show those both molds, the comedic but also the romantic, which is why she's such a great romantic comedy kind of an avatar, because she really is genuinely heartfelt and those sort of romantic scenes, but then she can also pull off the comedy. Oftentimes romantic comedies are either or. Sometimes they're really funny without being very romantic. Sometimes they're very romantic while having some cheesy jokes. But Diane Keaton is a perfect avatar because she can really nail both those sides. And I think Baby Boom is a classic example of that, and a defining role just in the sense that she is the star of the movie. She doesn't need any other co-stars. She is that main star. Then chapter 3, I'm calling her chapter. So you have the Woody chapter, the Nancy chapter, and then her chapter. Because after 2003, she doesn't work with Nancy Meyers again. She's never worked with Woody Allen after this period. She's really sort of defining herself. And this chapter, I called it her chapter because it's the Diane Keaton chapter. Because I think she's less interested now in becoming sort of an avatar for a director, and she's interested in developing her own movies. This is where we get Book Club and The Family Stone and just go with it. And it's like, okay, we know what a Diane Keaton movie is now. There's going to be some romance to it. There's going to be a comedic element. It's going to be sort of this quirky, likable character. It's never going to be too serious. It's going to be lighthearted. It's a great plane watch, you know. And in this period, she doesn't necessarily make classic movies like she was with The Godfather and Annie Hall. She sort of got it out of that period, and the quality of the overall films drop, but she has been successful in this period of making these kind of Diane Keaton movies, which are aimed at an older audience, almost always female, and made for sort of semi-low budget to really low budget movies. Our most recent movie, Mac and Rita, was made for less than $1 million. She's really sort of making these low budget movies, but hyper targeting to her audience and finding success at that. So she really has sort of created and cultivated a brand like few actors have, and because of that has had success. I mean, just think about this. She's an actor that's had a movie with over $100 million domestic total in the 70s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, and in the 2010s. She's been in big movies for 50 years. 70s, 90s, 2000s, except for the 80s, she's had a movie with over $100 million domestic total. She's been in the culture, and she's lasted because of her ability, I think, to obviously pick interesting projects early on in her career, but also sort of cultivate that Diane Keaton persona, so that we get a movie like a First Wives Club or a Book Club that are just so commercially successful and resonate with audiences that they're enough to sort of keep her career going, keep her sort of in the pocket of Hollywood. And in this period, there are certain films that are better than others, and probably my favorite of this period would be my defining role, which is Book Club. Most similar, I think, to a movie like First Wives Club, which just tells a sort of great formula of bring a bunch of talented people together, make them be best friends, and have it go. You have these 4 great actresses who are very funny, and you just want to see them sort of interact on the screen together. And I think the film actually does a very good job at managing all their sort of relationships and their sort of character arcs in their own separate lives, and then coming together to talk about it through the book club. It's a sort of a clever screenwriting tip, but I think also the movie does quite effectively sort of balance all those arcs, which is sometimes difficult to do in a 2-hour movie, but it does it very well. But one of the reasons why I picked this movie for Diane is because I think she has the best arc. She does seem like in the sort of book club scenes, electric and funny, and she seems like the friend that is friends with everyone else and is kind of the glue of the group. However, it really is her arc, aside from the book club stuff, that I think is the most effective in the film. She has a genuine sort of chemistry and relationship with Andy Garcia, so fans of the sort of Diane Keaton meet cute can appreciate that, myself included. But then she can also be sort of funny and witty in the book club scenes. And speaking of Andy Garcia, I mean, talk about a guy who's just totally nailed into the sort of older demographic, usually female audience. He's always playing the kind of hunk and Father of the Bride and Parvin Star and Mamma Mia 2 and now Book Club. And I think Book Club 2, eventually, he's really sort of carved out this niche for himself. It's kind of fascinating to see how his career went. But he's great at doing that in his relationship and the sort of funny back and forth with Diane Keaton. It's like you're watching kind of a Woody Allen movie from the 70s. There is that sort of instant chemistry. She is so great at working opposite other partners. So Andy Garcia, another charming guy, perfect. It makes things so much easier for them. But then, of course, I do think still the film succeeds, and Diane is so great in those kind of book club scenes in which they can talk about things, older women we don't see too often on screen talk about, like sex and relationships, and confront each other in philosophical and sort of moral divides between the women and how their lives have changed and evolved. It's a really interesting sort of movie that I sort of overlooked when it first came out, but I was glad I saw it a couple years afterwards on Netflix, because it is a sort of light, easy, charming, but very fun watch. So I do recommend Book Club if you haven't checked it out. Then the defining feature I'm calling Our High-Strung Queen. And throughout her career, I think there's definitely something as a Diane Keaton movie. It's usually, a romantic movie. It usually has to have some sort of comedy. It can be a comedic movie about relationships. It can be a movie about relationships that is funny. It can be a romantic movie that is funny about being romantic. There's all these different sort of combinations, but there is almost always comedy in them, and it's usually about relationships or about romance or has romance, but it's also very funny. That's kind of the sort of combination there. And then particularly the past 20, 25 years, she's definitely sort of aimed at, maybe we can say 30 years, aimed at these sort of older demographics, sort of post-First Wives Club, that sort of middle-aged to older demographics. She's had very success in sort of targeting those movies. You're not going to see her in an MCU movie. She's going to be in these comedies, and it really has held afloat a lot of these sort of studio comedies that we don't see too often. But she definitely sort of succeeded in the romantic comedy era in the sort of later half of her career, but then of course was so successful in the sort of romantic comedy stuff early on with the Woody Allen stuff. Oftentimes there's very few political commentary in her films. It's always about opposites. It's about the city versus the country. It's about men versus women. It's about old versus young. Always the sort of opposites. Always very silly, I would say, is the comedic style of her. It's smart, it's clever, it's funny, but also silly. It's never political or serious or have too much weight to it. There's always sort of an easiness and therefore a likability. So when we think of what Diane Keaton's so great at, it's because I think she's incredibly likable. Sort of that genuine kind of quirky energy where she could be awkward and nervous, but still very funny, still very neurotic, and bring that side. But it's not like an anxiousness like an Uncut Gems, which brings that weight onto you, or a Shiva Baby, which is nauseating at times. It's very much a sort of a light kind of an anxiousness. It's a nervousness. It's a giddiness. It's still likability. It's a quirkiness, but an honesty, a reality. I don't think people look at Diane Keaton and go, "Oh, that's an actor." They feel like, "Oh, that's a good friend of mine." Because of her great laugh, because of her great smile, and because of the type of movies she makes, which are very crowd pleasing, which are very light on its feet, not too much serious elements. It's like, and then usually in her movies, love is always, of course, that big thing. Love finds a way. Love in an affair always wins. Love when you don't think you actually love the person and they're the most opposite person away from you. By the end of the film, that sort of connection rules and ultimately has success. So these happy ending kind of films, and she's cultivated that to a very strong success. So when I think of Diane Keaton, she's almost always, you bring up her name, she's, oh yeah, she's great, she's funny. She's an incredible actress too. I don't want to get that sort of lost. If we're talking about Godfather 2 or even Annie Hall or Interiors, she can bring some of that, or Marvin's Room, she can bring some of that dramatic kind of a weight. But for the most part, when I think of Diane Keaton, I think of her and I smile. That's kind of my instant reaction. And I think that's because of her ability to be so fun and awkward and honest and kind of totally lovable. So that's why when I say, our high-strung queen, it's because she's high-strung, she's nervous, she's kind of giddy, but she's our high-strung queen. There's always a likability to it. There's a sense that she's a good friend of mine or any of the audiences. She does feel like she's that strong connection. She's not somebody that she feels like she's one of your family or one of your friend group, which is why she's so great at what she does, and ultimately a movie star. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your favorite Diane Keaton movies. Remember, Old Oscar Countdown is going to be returning in 2 weeks, so subscribe to the channel so you never miss that first episode, Best Picture predictions. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.